Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel today that we are hosting with the American Progressive Policy Institute. That is an American think tank as old as our think tank, the Liberální Institut. Both of our organizations were founded in 1989, and we are very happy that we can host an event together. The topic of today's event is broadband networks. The whole name of the event today is Funding the Next Generation of European Broadband Networks. It's based on a paper produced by the Progressive Policy Institute. And I would like now to introduce our panelists. So I'll start with our American guests. On my right, there's Michael Mandel, the chief economist at the Progressive Policy Institute. On my left, we have Mrs. Malena Dailey, the author of the paper that we are going to discuss. And now I can move on to our Czech panelists. On the very far left side, there's Ondřej Malý, a former Deputy Secretary of Industry and Trade and former member of the Council of the Czech Telecommunications Agency, the Czech version of the American FCC. Next to his right side, there's Mr. Jaromír Novák, a former chairman of the Council of the Czech Telecommunications Agency and a current advisor to the Secretary of Industry and Trade. And last but not least, to my right, Mrs. Jana, who is a regulatory affairs manager at CETIN, and CETIN is the largest provider of passive and active telecommunications infrastructure in the Czech Republic and one of the largest ones in Central and Eastern European region. With that, we can move to our panel. We'll start with Mr. Mandel and with Mrs. Dailey, and then we'll continue with the discussion among the panelists at first, and then hopefully there will be questions from the audience, who I very much welcome today, and I also welcome all of the viewers on our YouTube channel. I hope you will enjoy this event, and I hope we can collaborate with the Progressive Policy Institute even in the future on more panels, on more papers, more discussions. We have the paper also translated into Czech, so it should be available somewhere in the lobby and here on this table, and it's available on our website. We'll provide the links to everything under the video as well. So without further ado, I will give the floor to you or to Mr. Mandel first, to Mrs. Malena Dailey.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Malena. I study technology policy at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And we're here today to discuss, just to give you some context of the issue. Essentially, there's a conversation happening in Brussels discussing the future of kind of how we're funding broadband network expansion throughout the European Union, and some of the proposals that have come up include a fee on American tech companies to pay for increased data usage, which these telecommunications companies are coming to Brussels and saying we don't necessarily have the funding and the resources to really expand their networks with new technology, new like 5G technology, and they're saying that now, since it's a much more data-driven environment, rather than traditional voice traffic, that they're needing some kind of support for finding the resources to make that massive capital investment, right? And this is coming at the same time as the EU is really pushing their goals for the digital decade, which include the goal of having gigabit connectivity for every household in Europe, as well as 5G, in every populated area of Europe. So those are pretty big goals, and they're goals that we're there's steps being taken towards, but that's an enormous amount of investment for companies that say that they don't have the resources to make it. So what a lot of these companies are coming in and saying is that, we need support by those which are using the bandwidth that isn't necessarily being supported on current networks. So we did a paper just kind of exploring this idea, exploring whether or not that would actually sustain long-term capital investment. What we found just generally is that there's an enormous amount of investment coming into, the global network by a lot of these tech companies already. And the argument being made by a lot of these telecom operators is that, they're benefiting from their service, so therefore they should, the tech companies are benefiting from their service because obviously you can't get on Google, you can't get on Facebook, whatever else, if you don't have internet access. Who's providing the internet access? The telecommunications operators, right? So the argument is that, they're benefiting from it, they should be contributing to it. But what we're kind of seeing is that right now in the United States, but, similar trends exist in Europe, the tech companies are investing enormous amounts in network infrastructure in terms of things like subsea cables. There's plenty of examples of these tech companies which are building cables that connect even, there's the east coast of the United States with the west coast of Europe kind of thing, which are able to transmit enormous amounts of data that would not otherwise be possible. It was estimated that in 2020, global data transmission capacity increased by about 41% just because of these investments by tech companies. They also are the ones maintaining and operating a lot of the data centers, which are storing the data and transmitting to people both in the U.S. and Europe, and having as many locations of these as possible is really what's allowing people to get the data quickly with low latency, with faster speeds because of the amount of these centers. And then also we just looked at the level of capital investment by telecom companies over time, and we looked at declining ability by telecom companies to invest and kind of why that is, the regulatory reasons that is. In the EU, there's been some strict enforcement of competition law, which could prevent telecom companies from achieving the scale they need to really start investing in some of these kinds of things, and as well as just other regulations in terms of price caps on different types of services, which just limit the ability for capital investment. And what we're worried about is the same thing happening to the tech companies, right? So if you're suddenly, and the EU has put in recently with the DMA competition enforcement against tech companies. So doing that on top of potentially another tax, long term, are we crippling the ability for these tech companies to be investing? Because if they're investing massive amounts right now in the global network infrastructure, we don't want to take that away and reduce revenues to the point where a tax isn't even useful. So that's kind of where we're coming at it from. I'm extremely interested to hear the thoughts of the other people on this panel today because, obviously we looked at things from a very bird's eye view of the EU-US standpoint. So it gets a lot more specific when you're looking at it just on a company level. And I think that the landscape is different for every country. So I'm interested to hear kind of your guys' perspectives on what's happening exactly here, the ways in which that may or may not be relevant, and how specifically telecom companies think what you would see from this kind of proposal, and how that would benefit or hurt the current internet ecosystem here. So I will turn it over to Michael, I think.
Is the microphone on? So let me just say, I'm Mike Mandel. I'm the chief economist at PPI. Before this, I was the chief economist at Business Week. Let me just say a couple words about the Progressive Policy Institute first. We're a think tank in Washington, D.C., focusing on growth and innovation. Pre-COVID, We spent a lot of time traveling the world, doing policy both in Europe and in Asia, and actually South America as well. We see commonalities across different countries in terms of what sort of policies make sense. We have spent the last 10 years actually studying the relationship between the tech and telecom industries, okay, in terms of growth and in terms of jobs. We put out a report every couple of years on app economy jobs in Europe. The last one was published in May 2022. And we estimated that there was 52,000 app economy jobs in Czechia, which was quite a bit. We've also looked at information and communications sector jobs in Czechia. And what we found was that over the last 3 years, that employment in the Czechia information and communications sector rose by 11% compared to 0.7% for the economy as a whole. And this is actually about half the job growth in the Czechia economy over the last 3 years has come out of the information and communications sector, which is really very interesting and very important. And most of that seems to be tech and content rather than telecom. So when we look at policies for creating employment and good jobs, because these are all good jobs, when we look at policies for creating good jobs, we are concerned that transferring resources from the tech and content industries to the telecom industry will actually impair job growth. And this is an important consideration, not just here, but across the EU. And so let me just finish by saying that PPI's motto is radically pragmatic. That means we choose policies that work, okay? And we're looking for policies that generate growth and jobs. And we think that the telecom industries have done an enormously fantastic job creating amazingly technologically sophisticated networks, but it's not clear that they are job producers, whereas the tech and content industries have actually turned into surprisingly good job producers. So that's one of the places that we're focusing on. I think I'll stop here. I think this leads plenty of interesting topics to talk about. Thanks very much.
Okay, we've heard the opening statements from our American visitors, friends, and I think does anybody out of the Czech panelists have the need to say their opening statement first, or say something that needs to be said right away? Or I think Ondřej Malý is itching to speak, so I think I'll give him the floor.
That's better.
Hello and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I read it with a great interest, because it is an important, a very important debate right now in the on the EU level regarding the sort of fair share. I think the telcos do not really know what they are going into, because if you allow a regulator to say what's fair and what is not fair, you can end with some very unexpected results, I guess. I speak from my perspective, because I would be very happy as a regulator to have a say in what is fair and what is not fair. But anyways, the study is I would divide it into two parts. One is the description of the markets itself, and the other is the fair share. I greatly agree with what you wrote in the fair share part, because I think that one of my favorite analysts actually, he said that it's like a dinosaurs wanting to tax asteroids when the operators want to extract some value from the internet companies. But with the first part, it's actually much more tricky, because they'll say, like, to compare the US and the European market is almost impossible. Like, this is a really uphill battle, because in the United States, operators serve one country, or two in case of AT&T, which has also operations in Mexico. But AT&T and Verizon, they have a like minuscule overseas business. But in the EU, there is no European operator, such as in the US. None of the operators that are mentioned in the studies serve at least half of EU member states. Like Deutsche Telekom is present in Austria, Croatia, Czechia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, which is 9 if I count correctly. Vodafone in 7 or 8, Telefonica only in 2, Orange in 5, 6, and Telecom Italia Mobile in Italy. So it's like you do not have really an European operator, which is the first problem. So the market is really highly fragmented. 3 largest EU operators account for slightly over 40% of mobile service revenue. In the US, it's around 95%. So this is one thing. Then there's the investment part. Like with the investment, it is very hard to say that the US operators invest more than the EU operators, because if you count capex to revenue ratio, European operators have much bigger ratio than the US operators. Like in absolute numbers, the US investment is higher, but it's just amount of money. You know, you do not know if the US operators actually buy for the same exact amount of money, the same exact amount of technology that the European operators do, because you know, with the US, for example, like for some cybersecurity reasons, the US have excluded Chinese vendors from the market, so they are now facing a duopoly of Nokia and Ericsson, whereas a lot of European companies still freely buy stuff from 2 or 3 Chinese vendors. So this is one which in a way decrease the costs for the European operators simply by being present on the market. So this is one thing, that maybe the dollar-to-dollar value is not the same in the US and in European Union. So it's another thing. One thing is that maybe the reason that the European telcos do not like to invest is also their shareholder structure. And I'm not talking now about CETIN, because CETIN is actually like a very different story. But lots of big European operators are still at least partly state-owned. Like, for example, Deutsche Telekom is like 35% state-owned. Orange, 27%. Telia, which is from Sweden and Finland, it's 39.5% owned by the government of Sweden, and 10% of Telecom Italia is owned by Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, which is the government-operated bank. So, and this kind of shareholders, you get 2 problems. One is that they like dividends, and the other is that they block any and all like private equity corporate takeovers that you can have, and that might increase value for other shareholders, which was now seen by Telecom Italia actually, because the 10% shareholder of Telecom Italia, which is the Italian government, blocked the takeover by Telecom Italia by the KKR private equity fund. So this is another problem that we face in Europe. Then with the regulation, it's actually a much more tricky story than you have presented in the paper. The roaming regulation is a huge success of the European Union, and people love it, obviously. Yeah, that's true, but it's successful in a business and economics way as well. Roaming was an absolutely ineffective market. There is no market in roaming. You cannot incentivize the incoming roamers in any way possible. it's not possible to select a roaming provider once you are in the country. It's selected for you automatically. There was no incentive for the incoming... Sorry?
We see some disagreement.
Yeah, you can, but in effect you can't.
99.9% of them.
Yeah. Like you can do it manually, but no one does it. You had no incentive, like the operators had no incentive by the to lower prices, no incentive to change the underlying conditions and the underlying mechanism, which is basically set by GSM, was set by GSMA in the 90s, and it's a state-sponsored cartel by the European Union. The wholesale caps, they limit revenues, that's true, that's what you wrote, but they also limit costs. Especially for telcos with low incoming roaming, it's quite attractive. In many countries, such as in Czechia, I think Jana will also agree that in Czechia it's basically balanced, that the incoming roaming and outgoing roaming is the same, so you don't get any profit or loss, nothing, it just happens. And the roaming expenses themselves are not a very big problem for telcos. So I looked into Telia books, or the annual report. Telia is the Swedish operator, which is heavily outbound roaming reliant, because the Scandinavians travel a lot to the south. So they list roaming and interconnect as 4.5% of their operating expenses. And the EU-regulated roaming would be only a, like, I don't know if it's smaller part or bigger part of the number, but it's not like it's, the EU roaming will be only a part of this number. So it's not a big big percentage of the expenses for the operator. If you look at what the analysts say, they said that, for example, when there was a COVID, obviously the southern operators had a problem with no roamers incoming, so no revenues from roaming, which was quite bad. And the analyst said that Greece, Portugal and Spain are very exposed to tourism, and therefore operators in these countries will suffer the most. But a number of operators have indicated that roaming represents between 1% and 4% of mobile service revenues. So it's, again, it's not a big deal for the operators. It's definitely not a big deal, so they like refuse to invest at all. There's one thing that I've searched really hard for a study that will deal with the problem of the incoming roaming and its influence on, or the roaming regulation, its influence on investments in specific regions like Andalusia in Spain, like Italy, the beaches, because there's the problem with these regions is that in winter there is no one. In summer there are like millions of people who need to roam. So it's like for the operators really hard, because they need to invest into assets, into infrastructure that stands idle during like half of the year. It does nothing. So it's quite hard. But there has been no study. I have only found one study that dealt with the effect on tariffs on the price plans. And they said that they investigated waterbed effect if the regulated roaming created an effect with the rising tariffs, because the operators have to recoup their revenues elsewhere, which they didn't found. But they said that there is no study in like how the roaming regulation actually influenced investment in particular areas of, for example, Southern Europe. So this is one thing that's unfortunate, because I would love to read this. I would love to read about that, because I think this is the only thing that is really, let's say, questionable about the roaming regulation that you mentioned as one of the things that the telcos shall, that the regulators shall, let's say, not do, which I obviously disagree. But to conclude, how to make life better for the telcos so they invest more. One is network deployment bureaucracy, cut the red tape and permits. This is really, really super important. It's good that the Ministry of Industry and Trade, and maybe Jaromír will talk about it, is doing great work in that. And the government that first created the red tape now cancels the red tape, which is very productive. The second thing, it would be very prudent to incentivize investments through faster tax depreciation of assets. I think that the depreciation time is like 10 years, 20 years now with fiber. 15 years, which is super long. So it should be like 5. But the Ministry of Finance is really against that. So yeah, I had my fights. Make more spectrum available for unlicensed networks. There are not only fiber, not only 5G. Like fiber and 5G is only a part of the story. Unlicensed wireless networks are the second and very important part of the story, especially in the rural areas. I think that Czechia is like hugely successful in that. CETIN had a huge problem with that. They had to invest enormous amount of money to stay competitive against the smaller and regional rural operators. And obviously design spectrum auctions so they are not a cash grab, but actually benefit the society in some way. So this is, thank you very much. This is my maybe opening statement about the study, and I give the floor back to Martin.
Thank you. I guess we should give the floor to the other panelists first, and then you can respond. Makes sense?
Right. That's right.
So I'll give the floor to Mr. Novák, who is the current state representative here.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. It's very hard to continue after Ondřej's speech, which was quite comprehensive. I just want to highlight another statement from the study, which is saying that the European market is overregulated, and I somehow agree with this in the way that there is really huge administrative burden which is created to the operators or telcos market. And as Ondřej mentioned, in Czech Republic we've got a lot of smaller and regional players, and for them it's very hard to compete with this all administrative procedures and the requirements which they've got from the law and from the directive. And another regulations is coming like cybersecurity rules amended this year, and which will be implemented in another 2 years. And all the smaller and regional players fall under the scope of this regulation. So this will be quite challenging, and I truly believe that the Czech cybersecurity regulator will be very reasonable when he set up the rules. What we see that there is a huge fragmentations with the buildings law and administrative law. So this is really big hurdles for the operators to make efficient investments into networks. It's from my side, and we see it. It's bigger than and improving these rules would be definitely better than trying to regulate somehow this fair share fee or something like that. It's always funny that operators are coming with this same ideas every 5 years or something like that, and they trying to improve their wording. So at the beginning it was just a fee, now they are talking about transportation fee and or this fair share fee. So it's quite funny, and they are missing to add that also the content providers are doing their investments. It's the investments in the new codecs, it's the investments in the CDNs, putting it in the network, so the operators to get the content closer to their customers. So that should be also put it on the table and count with this. And just remember the discussions with the Tom Wheeler as a former chairman of the FCC about the net neutrality rules, and it seems to me that it's up and down attitude in the European market and US market. Every 5 years they are coming. So this is something which really put the European market behind this kind of regulations. And saying something about the fair share, I had to mention the practice from the vendors, because what we see recently that some vendors are limiting their devices for special technologies. I have to mention recent case of Google's Pixel, the latest one model, which is limited for the European market, that you are not able to use it for 5G. And it's something which is now investigating. There is probably no reason for it, but I think that it's really harming 5G development in both markets. So that is something that could be definitely improved.
I'm sorry, I'll ask for a clarification right away. It's regulated by whom? By Google or by regulators?
It's commercial decision, but it's really, yeah. It's commercial decisions, but it really makes no sense because it's really, if you are things that you buy device, it's 5G and it's not in special market in the Europe, so you have no belief that in the technology or in the vendor.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Hayes. And I don't know if this exists in American debate, but sometimes we're criticized for having manels, that is, panels only consisting of men. It's a word that is used in Czech. I don't know if it's used in English. It is. And so I'm glad we don't have a manel today. We have two women, so we have a very diverse panel today. And so this is a representative from the private sector. So interesting to hear your thoughts. Interested.
Thank you. I really do hope that this is not just gender consideration on this. I represent an operator. In fact, CETIN owns and operates the largest telecoms infrastructure in the Czech Republic, both mobile and fixed, and we are part of a larger group of companies in the CEE who operate this kind of infrastructure. We are a member of PPF group, which means we are anything but a dinosaur.
We didn't call you a dinosaur.
First of all, thank you for bringing the fair share debate to Prague. I am very thankful for it because I did not get to have a say in Brussels. But it does appear that, with the Czech presidency ongoing, some of Brussels debate do kind of transpire to Prague, which is good. I wanted to say a couple of remarks regarding the study, and then maybe connect it somehow to the fair share debate. There's a strong line in your paper that says that essentially says there's a potential for underinvestment in European networks, that the investment capacity is weakened by overregulation. First of all, I don't think that the picture is quite so grim in terms of investment in Europe. I did briefly look at some stats, just to, if we just look at the paper itself, and notwithstand the choice of operators, which in Europe it's really hard to find a representative operator. I agree with that. The capex to revenue ratio is actually higher for the European operators than for the American ones. So for their strength, they do invest more. The deployment of 5G is ongoing in most EU countries. That is, however, quite affected by the fact when the 5G spectrum auctions have been held. So that deployment is, in a way, connected with that timing. And plus, COVID supply chain problems for everybody in recent years means, I think that's everybody's problem. So we don't have to talk about that long. Fiber to the premises broadband connections. This is what we really need to talk about, the focus on broadband. High capacity broadband or NGA broadband in European speech. This is the thing of the past. We need to look at the FTTP connections, and the coverage in Europe in 2021 was at 50% of households. In the US, at 43% of households. That's what declared by the US Fiber Broadband Association. I am not sure what exactly they count as FTTP because Analysis Mason, as a respected source of data about telecoms, has a much lower figure for US FTTP connections. So I don't think that we fare so badly. And the year-on-year growth in FTTP connections is higher in Europe than in the US. We see year-on-year growth of 20% plus, while the US grows by about 12% new connections a year. So I don't think the picture is bad, but I see that what you might be saying is, if you're saying you need more money because you won't be able to invest, then the future might be somehow in peril. And I think this is where the fair share debate comes in. We have been carefully watching the debate in Brussels and wondering how this will play out. Quite personally, because I'm mostly a public affairs specialist, I was wondering how any telecom company is going to survive the public affairs crush once the digital platforms get on it. And it's starting to show it. Anyways, I think that one of the contributions of that debate could be that we will all be starting to look more carefully, and the regulators will start to look more carefully at just how exactly the entire internet ecosystem works, who peers with whom, for how much money and how, who pays for what, and where are the competitive bottlenecks in that entire ecosystem, rather than focusing on just the infrastructure part of it. I read a report by BEREC, which is an association of all European regulators, on their draft report on internet ecosystem published this June for consultation. Let me quote: "This report shows how a small number of digital platforms have reached a position allowing them to shape and restrict both the competition dynamics on different elements of the internet ecosystem and the relative openness under which content, services, and information can be accessed and shared." This is a direct statement that says, in the future, what you consider the open internet, the platform for everybody to share everything and innovate, might actually be suppressed by the competition issues at a different level of the ecosystem than what we've been looking at so far. And in that context, I think that fair share debate is quite useful. This is where my remarks end. Thank you.
Thank you. I might need to ask, what is FTTP? I might be the only person in this room who doesn't know what it is, but I don't know it.
Oh. Right. Fiber to the premises, meaning that optical fiber cable leads all the way from the transport network to the actual house, which allows for reaping the most benefits of just how fast light travels.
Thank you. Okay, do you want to go? Okay.
Yeah, so just for those of you who hadn't have time to take a close read of the paper, I want to give just some context of what we're kind of talking about in terms of some of this data and the comparison with the US. The paper takes the framing of comparing the EU and the US just in order to kind of highlight the ways that differences in regulation and differences in regulatory prioritization kind of materializes within these markets. Obviously, they are different markets, as you bring up, and I appreciate you kind of bringing up some of those differences in just how many operators there are per country. I think that is really important because that makes things much more complicated. So I do agree with that. I'll note that just in terms of the capital investment section of the paper itself, it is showing that there is significantly more capital investment by the top few American companies rather than, you know, if you look at like the top 5 like European companies, but it's a more fragmented market, so that's not the entire picture. But when you look at the year-over-year growth in revenue, consistently, and in the paper it's just between 2020 and 2021, but you know, going back a few years as well, just the growth in revenue is smaller between some of these U.S. companies and these European telecom operators, and that's not, again, like there are more companies, so it's not an entire picture, but you know, anecdotally you can kind of take that and look at what you will from it. And so the point of the paper is to really highlight the ways in which there are trade-offs between regulation and investment, and that there are trade-offs between like prioritization of consumers and prioritization of the financial stability of the market. So when you talk about roaming fees as well, yeah, it's, you know, it's seen as, I understand why it's seen as a success by consumers because, you know, it's helpful. And I think that there are some serious problems in the United States with non-consumer friendly regulation in terms of telecommunications. There's a lot of, you know, since there are only a few companies, there are a lot of areas that are really only served by 1 or 2 companies. And, you know, that leads to less consumer friendly contracts. That, you know, leads to higher prices, which the United States does have significantly higher prices to consumers in a lot of areas than, you know, a lot of their EU counterparts, which is an important thing to note. But when you're prioritizing these like very, very low prices to consumers, you're also, you know, the trade-off is the ability for companies to invest, you know. You might disagree with that. But I mean, if you have less money, you have less money to put out. I think the shareholder point is interesting as well, just in terms of like how companies are run. But when like it's not to say that one is better than the other, because I truly don't think that either has the correct answer. But it's the higher prices that are paid in the United States, you know, are also, so there's a lot of also a fair note that the revenue, the capital investment to revenue ratio is higher in the European Union, but you could make the same point that the capital investment per capita is higher in the United States. So they're spending more per person that's, you know, using the internet. So ultimately, all of these data points are kind of just to make the point that, you know, we have seen the impact that all of this regulation has given to this industry, and if we're looking at like a fair share tax or like something like that, we don't necessarily want to repeat the same kind of mistakes. You know, the technicalities of the current state of the telecom industry aside, we don't want to put tech companies then in the same spot where they are slowing investment, seeing weaker revenue growth, and ultimately leading to lower net investment in the sector in general, because that's what the entire sector wants, is just more investment to give more internet access. So
I see a debate brewing here, but I'll give the floor to you. You can use that microphone.
I figured that one's working, so maybe we should stick with that one. Okay, I'm just being pragmatic here.
This one should also work, but
okay.
I'll unhook it maybe.
I mean, we just stick with the same one. First, I actually want to just say one thing that I had forgotten at the beginning, which is to thank our hosts for putting together this terrific event and getting a really great panel. I appreciate everybody's comments, okay, and I found them very interesting. I just want to make a couple of big picture comments here to supplement what my colleague has said. Understanding the relationship between telecom and tech and content is very difficult, okay? If you go back 10 years, what you actually see, for example, is a lot of investment in the mobile networks, and people wondered how that would pay off. And it didn't really pay off until you had the invention of the smartphones and the app stores, which created an enormous number of downstream jobs, an enormous number of applications that finally made use of these networks. And if you look at the long-term picture, what you see is that telecom investment has stayed pretty much constant over this period, whereas investment in tech and content globally has risen tremendously. And the same thing for jobs. And if you consider the fair share proposal, which is to transfer large sums of money in one way or the other from tech and content to telecom, you sort of wonder whether or not you're transferring money to sectors that will sort of use it for growth in the same way. And that's kind of a little bit of what Malena is saying in terms of the paper. Okay, it's a big picture assessment. So we take the comments. We've spent a lot of time doing cross-national analysis of different countries, whether or not it's in Europe or in Asia or in South America. And we have a lot of respect for people's local knowledge that we cannot duplicate. And so we take actually the comments that you made about not getting everything perfectly right. We take it very seriously, and I'm actually sort of sitting here thinking how we can sort of do it better the next time. Okay. What was that?
I'll be happy to help.
Well, that'd be terrific. But we do think that the big picture that we paint here about what the right policy is, I think still holds true in terms of that a transfer across sectors is not likely to pay off either in higher capital investment or in faster growth or in more good jobs. It's not quite clear that is the right thing to do. So I think I'll sort of stop at this point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Malý wants to speak.
Yeah, sorry. Just one thing about the competition and investment story. This is a long-term debate that we were having it in within the regulator, I think, with the operators and all. The problem is that companies invest because it gives them competitive advantage, not because they are happy with investing because of it's their nationalist obligation or something like that. They invest if they see that they will get a competitive advantage. The lower the competition, the less incentives to invest. In the United States have a lower level of competition than Europe. The European operators are in much more competitive environment, so they invest more. It's seen from the capex to revenue ratio, which is really, really important. I think it's like industry standard ratio that's used usually for the investment level, to explain the investment level. So this is like really, really important. And the European regulators, they did not think about prices when they regulate. They think about competition. Like the more the competition, we always thought about bringing more competition to the market. The more competition to the market, lower the prices, bigger the investment.
So can I actually just step in here for a second? I mean, I think I can come to the same conclusion that you came to earlier, which is that if there isn't the capital investment problem, there's no reason. I mean, there's no reason to sort of transfer.
Yeah. To
transfer funds.
I mean in 2021, the average dividend yield of Eurostoxx 500 was like 2.5%. The dividend yield of Telefonica was 5%. So their dividends are much higher than the overall stock market index. So they do not. It's not like they have problems with free cash flow. They have a lot of free cash flow.
I think we have found a very interesting divergence here, where some people tell one story, some people tell another story, and some people tell different stories in different audiences depending on the point that they're trying to make. Okay, and I'm not saying that anybody's not telling the truth here, but it's a funny situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say really is that I think the European model is really, really successful. It has brought us low prices and relatively high level of investment. If you look at the investment into specific gimmicks like 5G, which is, in my opinion, it's completely irrelevant. Like to think about investments directly into 5G, you have to think about investments into connectivity. If you look into investments to connectivity, then the European model has been really successful so far. If you look into investments into like things like 5G or Warner Media, which was one of the highest investments of AT&T, and it was like spectacular failure because they bought it, I think, for like $200 billion or something, and they sold it for like 14 billion or something like that. It was like the most spectacular destruction of shareholder value by a telco operator in the world, and it was made by the American operator. So like, this is not really success. This is the model that is not really successful, you know. Like the model where the telcos invest in telco assets, which is the kind of European model, it has been successful for us, like a lot.
If I may react, this is what I've been saying is that investment has not been bad at all in Europe. I agree on that with Ondřej. And as an operator who is not a member of any Brussels association, just to be clear on it, we actually don't want that money from those digital platforms, mostly because we don't think we'd get it, even if we wanted it. Trust me, I've researched exactly how that proposal should work, and I did not see a way how it would. And so I don't think that there is any viable way to extract any value from one part of the ecosystem to the other in this way. Maybe in the future there will be new products, new ways of interconnecting and so forth, but this is for the future. For the internet ecosystem as it is now, with this legislation or to-be legislation, I don't see that as a viable way of doing things. What would most likely happen is that digital platforms get taxed, which might happen for other reasons too. But anyways, we wouldn't see a penny of it.
So can I ask you a question, just as like we're kind of looking at this and like trying to debate, you know, so you don't really see a need for telecom to be supported financially. You think that like in Europe they're doing okay, they have the revenue to be doing these things, and you know it's a non-starter, like it's not a question, or is that, you know, what do you think?
Well, not entirely. The answer is always more complicated than the question.
Yeah, of course.
But I just don't think that this particular method of transferring revenue by legislation is going to work. But the goals of the digital decade are very ambitious, and what we've seen so far with the growth levels of, say, fixed fiber connections, is reaping the low-hanging fruit. From now on, it's just going to get more difficult and more expensive. And this is why we already see subsidy programs rolling out across Europe to reach the most remote areas with subsidized telecom infrastructure, in fact. But I would like to make sure that it's clear this is not just going to be the case in Europe. US is going to have that same problem to reach with fiber the most remote areas. And with the cost of laying infrastructure being what it is, there's not going to be any other viable way. And if we consider that infrastructure to be essential to people's lives, well, then we have to roll it out with public money. So that was my point.
Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Novák, just to say something? You haven't had the floor for a while.
It's interesting to listen to the arguments. And just was thinking about the rollout of 5G because it's really. It was a huge debate on the European level about the pan-European operator about 10 years ago, and the member states, they were not willing to give up the power to Brussels, to give the spectrum, give the money to Brussels and have their pan-European operator. And therefore, we see all the auction procedures are fragmented, and there is different timelines on granting the spectrum in each member state. Because there were states like Germany where they auctioned 700 already, and in some member states like Bulgaria, they still haven't auctioned 800 megahertz for 4G. So this could be a problem, but on the other hand, there were also the part of the discussions, are the operators ready to pay in one moment huge money for pan-European licenses for spectrum? And the answer was no, they are not. They are not ready to roll out it in one time in all member states. So I think that in some parts of the regulations or regulatory framework, the fragmentations is bad, but in sometimes it gives some possibility to really plan and to prepare the investments in each market, because each market is differently developed. There is no same size of the market.
Thank you. Somebody has a contribution on that they want to say.
Just from my perspective, that this is a very, very interesting discussion on real issues, and very often when these topics come up, people engage in grandstanding, and it's wonderful to hear a real discussion about the underlying issues.
Okay. Should I give the floor to the audience? If there's no pressing need among the panelists to intervene? Okay, questions. I'm sure you must have a question. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll pick one. Jiří Schwarz, AAU. First question I might ask, I don't know whom, maybe it goes to CETIN, but also others. There is much talk of 5G, but is it really the future, or shouldn't this technology be skipped in favor of, I don't know, fiber and some wireless for the last couple of meters only? This is my first question. Thank you.
Who knows the answer?
And then let him go first, and then I'll go second.
5G is just another G. We had 4G, and we didn't have an European action plan to deploy 4G. We didn't have it, and we deployed 4G quite fast. And it was not magical, it was just normal, and we had mobile internet in our mobile phones or in our smartphones. With 5G, for some reason that I do not really understand, it was regarded as some sort of magic dust that will heal all our ailments, that will, solve the Middle East problem and end the world's hunger and bring us the robotic surgeries and autonomous cars and whatnot. It's just another G. The only business case so far is fixed wireless access right now. Nothing else. We didn't have robotic surgeries, and we will never have robotic surgeries on 5G. We will never have autonomous cars on 5G. Look at what's happening now with the European telcos. The European telcos now say that if there is a blackout or lack of energy in European Union, that they might not be able to operate their networks, and they want some reassurances that that there will be energy supplies into the radio access network in case of rationing or this kind, So there will be no, you cannot offer a service level agreement that's, you know, that's based on the government giving you some reassurance that that your network will not be cut off. So there will not be any autonomous car running on 5G. And essentially, as I said, it's just another G. Like, it's not a revolution, you know. It's important because mobile telecommunication is important, but it's not a revolution.
Let me just, I mean, you ask a really good question. 5G is supposed to solve, I mean, and I'm not disagreeing with you at all. 5G is supposed to solve a very specific problem, which is that there was very little business take-up of mobile for business, specific business uses, okay? You look at the government input-output tables and you see little spending on telecom by, say, manufacturing companies and so forth. And so 5G will be successful if it creates business cases. Now, if you sort of look back at the business case for 4G, and actually it was really 3.5G, okay? You didn't have a valid business case for the previous generation until you had smartphones and apps. Before that, it was, I mean, this is why AT&T signed up with Apple, okay? And so really what we should think about now is what is the best way to create these new 5G applications that open up things that couldn't be done before. And that becomes, so we're sitting on the cusp right now of innovation. And some people think that this is not going to be big innovations. And some people think that it is. And I put PPI in the positive case. And so clearly we have to be able to have the investment happening in areas where innovation could occur. So this brings it back to the topic of the panel.
I wanted to comment that there will be very few surgeries and very few electric cars running after a while of a blackout. So the unavailability of that mobile network will be quite irrelevant. Just for those who are not from the field, the mobile towers are mostly backed up with power, either and or batteries and diesel generators. So for quite a while, we are able to maintain service in case of a blackout. Long term, obviously, this is not tenable. The problem with 5G is it's another generation, good, yes, but it does enable quite a lot, but the use cases for it are still difficult to find and implement, because how many surgeons actually know and want to do a surgery online, and the regulatory environment for running an automated car is extremely complex as well, and where would you run it in the first place with all the human drivers around? So it's really difficult, but this is a path for maybe the next cheese.
Sorry, it was G's, not cheese.
Thinking of dinner.
Guys, if you are thirsty, you're free to take some wine or whatever, or some cheese. I have a question. How long does the tower last then in a blackout? I assume it's longer than my phone, but I don't know. Are we talking days or weeks?
No, we're talking hours.
Okay, so my phone will outlast the tower in a blackout.
You can look at pictures you have saved on it.
Yeah. Anybody wishes to intervene? More questions? We have at least 2 more, so, but I'll be happy to give the floor to other members of the audience.
You can think of other questions. You mentioned installing new infrastructure, that it it's costly, complicated. From what I heard, in Czechia, the regulation or the regulatory hurdles that you have to jump over when trying to install new infrastructure are really high, and the costs therefore are really high as well. I would like to hear about. Maybe it's in the study. I'm sorry, I didn't read it. I would like to hear about a comparison. How does this work in the US compared to Czechia, Europe? I don't know if the problem is common in the whole Europe or not. But how does it work in the US? What are the costs of installing new infrastructure in the sense of the regulatory costs? Thank you.
I think that, or should I? You ask a really good question that we don't have a really good answer to. Okay, so there's obviously regulatory barriers in the U.S. that this is one of those cases where it's very location specific about what the regulatory barriers are. In the U.S., a lot of the there's regulation that's at the national level, there's regulation that's at the state level, there's regulation that's at the local level. And so part of making these things happen, whether or not it's in U.S. or in Europe, is figuring out exactly where the bottlenecks are for each particular area and trying to make them less. Right? In the U.S., we've had a lot of, it's part of our, the last couple of years under President Biden, we've had a lot of money put into funding a broadband build-out in the U.S. And it turns out is that if you put a lot of money into it, you're going to get more results. Okay? And you'll also convince people that it's important enough to not to stand in the way. So I think that I would not want to make any direct comparisons between the U.S. and Czechia without looking into more detail.
Yeah, in the European Union, you've got special regulatory regime, the directive on the reduction of the cost for building the broadband networks, and it's from 2016, I think, 17. And I remember in the reasoning of this directive there was that you are able to save almost 70% of the cost of building the new network if you are able to share the information that you are digging there in this area and somebody comes and you have the share this cost and you put more infrastructure player in this place. And there are different stories. In Portugal, you are really able to get a silent agreement that you are able to build the network in 1 month. In Czech Republic, there is nothing like this. You know that we are ex-communist country, so the people are very sensitive that you would like to use right of way in the property which belongs to some people. The property is also, the land property is also fragmented if you would like to build a big road. So it's quite complicated. The Ministry of Industry and Trade is now preparing the amendment of the law saying if you are preparing some new investments to building some kind of infrastructure, you should put your aim in some special database and you can get in this database and see, okay, in this region we are planning to build this kind of road or improve the road or improve the pavement and so on. So to get this information and to say, okay, I can put the fiber inside or put the duct inside this road and to save some money. So, but it's really long-term shot.
Just to add another perspective from the U.S. as well, I think a lot of like what the Biden administration's been focusing on is funding for like rural broadband. So like a lot of these areas where it's like really just not profitable for these companies to get out there and build because there's just not enough people to pay for it. And on that's been a state-by-state basis where these companies are either having to go in and like make proposals about what areas they're seeing as being underserved, which is, it either relies on the efficiency of the company to be able to get into that area, or, the state is saying, hey, this is where we desperately need more internet access, and then like asking like, okay, who can do this the most efficiently, who can be the most cost effective about this. But there has been a decent amount of federal support for those more like state-driven projects, which has been an interesting thing that's happened like mostly since COVID.
Mr. Malý, you wanted to speak, but if you have the mic ready, you can.
Thanks. I just wanted to throw in.
Whoever has the mic has the floor. So,
I wanted to throw in some numbers. It takes, on average, about 12 months to get the red tape done when you're trying to cover a particular area with fiber network. That red tape consists of the public and the private part. The public part means we have to talk and get the proper paper from anywhere from 20 to 50 various institutions, which all they have their opinion on how you should build something, and you have to incorporate that in your project. And then you have numerous, and because the land ownership is so fragmented, very, very numerous number of private owners who have to agree with you laying the network on their property. And that is not always easy. So the cost consists of various fees for these rights of way, which are technically regulated by law, but in practice, just how many disputes do you want to have with landowners and run them and to courts and so forth? Impracticable. So it takes a long time just to get through the red tape, and then you have to actually build it. Yes, coordination can decrease costs, and not by our experience, not quite by 70%. It's far less than that. But it also is a very complex task, because having that information that somebody else is going to dig up a sidewalk in the area that you're trying to dig up is not everything. A lot of other things come into play, like when exactly are you going to dig, and how much is your digging work. The experience is when an electricity distribution company digs, it's about twice as expensive as when we dig. And now, if they're going to share 50% of their cost, it's like our full cost. So it's not exactly profitable this way. So that there's another problem. Plus, making them actually making anybody tweak their project so that you can coordinate, it also has some cost. And where does that cost go? We've been quite vocal about construction law issues for a while. And the situation has been notoriously bad, and it still is notoriously bad in the Czech Republic. Thank you for letting me complain.
No, it's true. I can, sign up for everything that you said. Although I'm partly to blame because I was a state servant then. So, but the thing is that future will be better tomorrow, to quote a great American president. We are having a new act at the European level, which is going to solve all the problems, as the European regulations usually do. And it's called CIA, which is a nice acronym, Construction Infrastructure Act or something like that. And Connectivity Infrastructure Act, yeah. And the funny thing is that the fair share is supposed to be a part of this act, which means that it's going to be passed in 2038. After a long and fruitful debate with the digital giants that in the meantime, they will probably buy half of European telcos just for fun. So, yeah. So this is going to be like that.
Okay, before we get to the last question, I have a question which is very basic, but maybe very complicated. Why is it that the US has these large operators and the EU does not? Is it because the US government was strong first and then the telcos came, and in the EU it's the other way around? Is it because the market is new and it will in 15 years develop, or why is it, if it's possible to say succinctly?
Well, it's because the US was founded in 1776 and the EU was founded only after the World War, where the telegraph companies were already in place. And so it's fragmented a lot. That's a simple question, and obviously that, as well as in case of electricity, telcos were state monopolies up until the 90s. So you remember that we had Český Telecom, which we loved a lot. It was I think it was the only telecom company that we had actually demonstrated against. We held a huge rally in 1998 against the internet prices in Czechia. In front of the Czech Telecom. It was quite interesting. It was probably for many people it was the first time when they learned that there is such a thing as the internet in 1998. So it was like it's the matter of national monopolies. Like, there was a French national monopoly, Orange. There was a Spanish national monopoly, now Telefonica, German Deutsche Telekom. That's why it's called Deutsche Telekom, right? Every country had its state monopoly. So we now have 27 ex-incumbents that were, sold and resold over time. Some of them are publicly traded, some of them are not. Some of them are not publicly traded anymore because the current owner has pulled them away from the public market, such as O2/CETIN. It's lots of different stories there.
If I could just give like a U.S. perspective to that question as well, I think in terms of competition law in the United States and how the U.S. has kind of approached competition in the telecom market, there's been a sort of perspective that, let me just give an example. So there was a merger a couple years ago between Sprint and T-Mobile in the United States, which were like the third and fourth biggest telecom operators, which were following Verizon and AT&T, but were pretty far below. They were not quite competing at that level, and they wanted to merge. And the argument for mergers is if it's creating significant consolidation in the market, like they're not really supposed to happen under antitrust law. But the argument with that was that the merger between those two, like third and fourth biggest companies, would allow them to kind of compete with the top two companies. Therefore, maybe consolidating the market a little bit, but putting more competition at the top of the market. There's very different views on whether that was a good thing. But that's just part of the perspective in the United States a little bit with something as big and as capital intensive as building out network infrastructure, where it's like you really can't just decide one day that you're going to start a telecom company, and you have to be able to service, if you're going to service the entire United States, that is a lot. So the United States at the moment has more of a market that's not a lot, but a couple big companies competing at like a big level rather than, a bunch of small ones, having to like network share and things like that.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question to this. Does the roaming regulation inhibit the operators from, entering more markets in the EU because they don't see because I could see that you could have a competitive advantage being T-Mobile and saying, we'll give you the same price everywhere in Europe without the regulation. This incentive is gone. Does it
does it? You know what I'm talking about? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense actually. But in 1997, I think, was the Mannesmann Vodafone Mannesmann deal. Yeah, no, I don't know. I can't remember. Okay, okay, good. So I remember that there was an operator in Germany. It was called Mannesmann, and it was bought by Vodafone. And there was some thinking, as far as I remember, that there will be some price mechanism, as you described, where the T-Mobile or Vodafone customers will have like better pricing in each country where they are operating, and it was very much frowned upon by the competition authorities because they will have obviously unfair advantage by being on various markets, whereas the local operators that are only on one market, such as, for example, DNA in Finland or Byte in Latvia, they would not have this kind of advantage, so they will be forced to be sold or to consolidate. And the thing is that consolidation is not always good. I'm on that side in Sprint and T-Mobile merger that is not really looking at it like very favorably, let's say. I'm quite happy that this didn't happen in many European countries, because, for example, in Italy, the people have like decent network and very low prices. Ultimately, even in Czechia, we have lower prices than we used to have in like 5 years ago. This telecom sector is actually the only sector that's surveyed by the Czech Statistical Office that is not in inflation; it's in deflation since 2015. And yet we still can call and connect to internet and be happy about it.
Let me actually just add a little bit to that the U.S. telecom sector is in deflation as well, okay, as is the U.S. tech sector. I mean, we've done a lot of work on digital inflation, and there's a lot of prices being tracked on the business-to-business side, producer prices in the digital sector, and overall, the inflationary surge did not hit the digital sector at all in the U.S., which is really very interesting in terms of the fair share debate, because we see that to the extent that that the tech and content companies have been building out their investments, that consumers have been benefiting from it. There's no sense in which the consumers have not been benefiting from it. And it really raises some very interesting issues about what the purpose of fair share is.
Okay, I think we have the time for one last question, unless there's somebody else in the audience who I would... Yes. Do we have a...
Good evening, Michal Petrouš. And if I understood correctly, one of you mentioned that the auction of the spectrum could be somehow improved. And my question is if you can elaborate on that, how it could be improved.
Okay, so the way to distribute spectrum in the European Union is like this: if you have it for the first time, like if you free the spectrum for the mobile or fixed or whatever usage, and you limit the amount of companies that are supposed to auction the spectrum, or are supposed to get the spectrum in ultimately, then you have usually you do an auction. And the auction says that basically you pay for the spectrum and you get the right to use it for 20 years now is minimum. Usually it was 15, but now it's 20 or 30 years. And after that, there's a huge divergence among the member states. Some member states, have it for perpetuity. No, that's not member state, it was UK. UK, it's just indefinite. In the UK, there's an indefinite usage of spectrum. Once the operators auction it, they just pay for usage and then use it forever. And in some member states, it's re-auctioned, which is, in my opinion, quite insane, because you basically tax the operator again and again and again, and I don't know about any moment when the spectrum actually switched hands between two operators after the re-auction. When it was maybe in Netherlands, or I don't know, maybe in Netherlands or Belgium. Yeah. And then there's our case, which is like a combination. When you auction the spectrum and the time is up, then the regulator asks the like the soudní znalec. What's the English term for that? It's like expert valuator to value to let's say to say what the value of the spectrum is for the next 15 years or 20 years, and then the operators have the right to pay it or forfeit it forever, and then it's possibly re-auctioned. So it's like it's a little bit better, because the valuator usually it's just his opinion, not the market that does it. So it's a little bit better for the operator. But the thing is that it's always, you always extract some value from the operator, from the market, to the state coffers, which is like, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But it's always better to attach some conditions with it, or to give it to the operators like forever, I think, And usually what's been happening in several member states was that the member states just wanted to get money from the auction, and that was it. That was the case, for example, in Italy with the C-band auction. That was insanely expensive. Like they will never make any money on that forever, because they paid like billions of euros for spectrum with a very with the business model that's like very tentative. So yeah, this is I think that this should be really improved, and the government should never ask for money in the first place, but think about how to improve the whole ecosystem, how to improve the like how to improve the situation for the consumers, perhaps. That's what we did actually. Like I need to pat myself or Jaromír on the shoulder, because we attached a lot of conditions on for the auction in 2013 and 2020, like coverage obligations and wholesale obligation, national roaming obligation, stuff like that, to increase the competition. And I think that especially in terms of coverage, Czechia is really very well covered by 4G. And this is probably because when you compare it to 3G before, then 3G was available for like 30% of the population. 4G is for 99.5% of the population, which is markedly better, I think. So at least in this we were quite successful. So I would like to see other regulators to adopt this approach.
If I may add, spectrum is a limited resource, and until there will be time and technology that you are able to have unlimited players in band, like in 8G, there will be unlicensed band somewhere, and everybody who wants to offer service, they can, and build infrastructure. Until then, you have to find the way how to distribute the spectrum, and you have two options, basically: beauty contest and auction. Beauty contest in Czech Republic is not very nice word, and because it seems from the past it's quite untransparent, and you never get what you wanted. So everybody is now doing the auctions, and when you are preparing auctions, there are always guys from the Ministry of Finance. They are saying, okay, we want to get more money in the budget. We give you more money to salaries for your people, the regulator, but we want to get more money from the auction. And it's very hard to persuade them, even if you are independent regulator, that it's not the case, that for the market it's better if there is really good balance with the spectrum conditions and price. And when you are selling the spectrum. And other story are the people who would like to really influence the market, and you have to really have the good system how to discreet the false positive new entrants to the market. It can really trick and play with the price of the spectrum. But as an old Chinese proverb says, no spectrum, no party. The party is really quite important. The spectrum is quite important for next development of the operator at all.
Well put by Sun Tzu, I think. Closing remarks by anybody? Okay, you can use your mic.
Once again, very appreciative to our hosts for putting this on. This has been an absolutely terrific panel from our perspective in terms of a real deep discussion into these issues that are so important, and including ranging on the questions of what is 5G and why. Okay, what is FTTP, and I can speak for both of us that this has been absolutely terrific. Thanks.
Anybody else? If not, then I'll have my closing remarks. It was an unusual panel for us, not least because we had government regulators patting themselves on the back. That doesn't usually happen at Liberální Institute's events. So we're breaking new ground here. Hopefully we've made some good connection with the PPI in today's event, and I hope all of us could have some fruitful cooperation going forward from this. I personally do not understand the telco market that much, so I learned a lot. Not only what FTTP is, hopefully, but other things. I have a lot of questions here, but we'd be here for a week. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all for watching us on YouTube later. And I will now invite you to continue the discussion informally in the lobby, and enjoy the wine and the chlebičky. And thanks for coming.